On December 8th, 1783, Paris awoke beneath a gray sky, veiled by a damp fog that clung stubbornly to the worn facades of the houses. The cobbled streets, still slick from yesterday's rain, echoed with the heavy tread of Republican guards. At the end of their escort, at the center of every gaze, walked a woman dressed in white. Her hands were bound, her fair hair poorly hidden beneath a plain headdress, and her blue eyes that once could make a king tremble, were now dulled by anguish. It was Jeanne Bécu, better known as Madame du Barry, former favorite of Louis XV. She was no longer the radiant Countess of Versailles' grand balls. That morning, her face bore the marks of sleepless nights, of stifled tears, of a fear that no beauty could conceal. And yet, in her bearing, one could still glimpse a trace of her past elegance, like a faint echo of the grandeur she once embodied. The crowd, massed around the cart, never let her out of their sight. To some, she symbolized corruption, excess, and the debauchery of the Ancien Regime. To others, she was merely a woman swept away by the cruelty of history, a sacrificial victim of a collapsing world. The dull rumble of wheels against stone accompanied this funeral procession. With every turn, Jeanne drew closer to the Place de la Révolution, where the scaffold loomed like a gaping maw, hungry for noble and bourgeois blood. She knew that others had already walked this path. Marie Antoinette, Philippe d'Orléans, and so many faces that once haunted the corridors of power. Now it was her turn. It is said that in that moment, her courage abandoned her. Her sobs, her desperate pleas rang out, shattering the image of the frivolous favorite people had delighted in hating. As she climbed the rough wooden steps, her legs trembled. The executioners, pressed by the relentless machinery of terror, forced her beneath the blade. Then, in a final surge of humanity, Jeanne implored, "Just a moment more, Monsieur le Bourreau. Just one more instant." A simple phrase, torn from the visceral fear of death, yet one that echoed across time with haunting poignancy. That plea, more than the caprice of a woman accustomed to getting what she wanted, resounded as the universal cry of humankind in the face of the inexorable end. The blade fell. The sharp crack silenced the entire square. What remained of Jeanne du Barry was nothing but a memory, a faint perfume of ambition and beauty extinguished in the violent clash of an era. But who had this woman truly been, whom the crowd both adored and despised? How had a child born in the shadow of modest poverty risen to become the blazing star of Versailles, only to be swept away by the revolutionary storm? Here begins her story, a path woven of grace, scandal, splendor, and downfall, a destiny at once radiant and tragic. Long before the mirrors of Versailles reflected her silhouette, Jeanne Bécu was nothing more than an anonymous child in the grayness of provincial France. She was born on August 19th, 1743, in Vaucouleurs, Lorraine, the illegitimate child of a fleeting affair between Anne Bécu, a modest seamstress, and a defrocked monk, whose identity remains shrouded in rumor. From her very first days, Jeanne bore the mark of illegitimacy, a stigma that the society of the Ancien Regime never forgave. Her childhood unfolded in an atmosphere of dignified yet fragile poverty. Her mother, a courageous woman, weighed down by daily hardships, did everything she could to give her daughter a semblance of normality. The home was cramped, the meals meager, but Jeanne already stood out. Radiant blonde hair, a fair complexion that seemed to capture the light, and above all, a spark in her gaze, a mix of innocence and quick intelligence. It is said she was aware of her difference very early on. While other children played barefoot in the dusty streets, Jeanne stood apart, silently watching the carriages that rolled through town, the ladies in silk gowns stepping into church, the men with their powdered wigs. In her child's imagination, she projected herself into another world, a world she had never touched but instinctively sensed existed. At the age of 10, her mother placed her with a cousin in Paris, hoping to secure a better future for her. For the little provincial girl, arrival in the capital was a shock. Paris roared with rumors, cries, songs, and bustling markets where the scents of fish, wine, and leather mingled. Yet beneath the vibrancy, the city revealed its cruelty. Beggars sprawled in doorways, wandering children, the desperate cries of the destitute. Jeanne, however, was not frightened. She absorbed the capital with eager eyes. She quickly realized that beauty itself could be a form of capital, an invisible weapon. Even as a child, the gazes she drew were different. Her golden hair, her proud bearing despite her youth, her radiant smile, already won her a singular kind of attention. As an apprentice in a modest dressmaker's shop, she grew familiar with precious fabrics, fine lace, and ribbons that fed the dreams of high-born ladies. Her clumsy hands learned to stitch, but her mind absorbed the conversations of clients, salon intrigues, arranged marriages, rivalries between great families. The world of the powerful unfolded before her, like a stage on which she longed to play a role. It was during this time that she first learned the art of seduction, at first instinctively. She was only 15, when men began lingering in the shop not to buy, but to admire little Jeanne. She already knew how to avert her eyes at the perfect moment, to laugh with innocent charm, and within that laugh, one could already glimpse the woman who would one day bewitch a king. Thus, amid the tumult of Paris, an illegitimate child was slowly forging an extraordinary destiny. Nothing yet revealed how far this trajectory would take her, but already, like a seed planted in unlikely soil, the legend of Madame du Barry was beginning to take root. By the age of 16, Jeanne was no longer a child. Paris, that voracious and unforgiving city, had already begun to shape both her features and her spirit. She had learned the harshness of social hierarchies, but also the power of a smile offered at just the right moment. In the narrow streets of the Latin Quarter, in noisy stalls and smoke-filled taverns, she discovered a perpetual theater in which everyone played a part. She, without yet fully realizing it, was perfecting her own role. It is said that she was first placed as a shop assistant with a celebrated milliner. It was there that her beauty burst into the open. The clientele, ladies of quality who came to order ribbons and hats, often found themselves staring at Jeanne more than at the fabrics they purchased. Men, too, always seemed to find pretext to linger, to chat, to tip generously. Jeanne was not simply pretty. She possessed an instinctive grace, a sparkle in her gaze, and a musicality in her voice that charmed without effort. Soon, fleeting protectors appeared. She was noticed during public promenades in the Tuileries, where even her modest gowns seemed to gain an elegance no craftsman could have designed. She learned to walk like a lady, to laugh without showing too many teeth, to wield conversation as deftly as an open fan. Every gesture, every word became a subtle weapon. But Paris offered not only opportunity, it demanded defense. Jealous colleagues, insistent suitors, rumors that could destroy a reputation in an instant. Jeanne, a keen observer, understood that to survive, she needed more than charm. She needed to conceal, to calculate, to choose her alliances carefully. In that murky environment, she developed the paradoxical mixture of innocence and cunning that would one day make her the king's mistress. By the age of 18, her reputation for beauty had already spread beyond the walls of the boutique. Libertines sought her out, men of society desired her. It was then that she crossed paths with Jean-Baptiste du Barry, an adroit adventurer, trafficker in pleasures, and broker of liaisons, who immediately recognized in this young woman a raw gem waiting to be polished. For him, Jeanne was not merely a potential mistress, she was an instrument of fortune and influence. Under his guidance, she entered the circles where one dined late, wagered large sums, and exchanged secrets between glasses of champagne. Jeanne shone in these gatherings. Without title, without wealth, she imposed herself through the authority of presence, through the beauty that demanded nothing but received everything. Her crystalline laughter made debts forgotten. Her gaze drew confessions from reluctant lips. Already she was learning to reign, not over a kingdom, but over desire itself. Her ascent was fragile, balanced on the whims of the powerful. Yet deep in her heart, Jeanne sensed that something greater awaited her, as though, behind every closed door, a vaster destiny was being prepared. In the salons of Paris, whispers of her name began to circulate. Soon, those whispers would reach the gilded halls of Versailles. By the age of 20, Jeanne had already left behind the modest milliner's shop that had once defined her early years. She was now swept into the glittering yet treacherous world, where intrigues and pleasures intertwined. It was there that a decisive figure entered her life. Jean-Baptiste du Barry, a minor nobleman, compulsive gambler, and master of shady dealings. He was known as Le Roué, the Rake, for a life woven out of schemes, debts erased by timely liaisons, and flamboyant escapades in Parisian salons. The moment he laid eyes on Jeanne, he knew he held a winning card. Her beauty was not merely alluring, it was magnetic. She possessed that rare combination of freshness and sensuality that irresistibly drew attention. For du Barry, accustomed to manipulating courtesans and reselling their favors to great lords, Jeanne was no ordinary conquest. She was a jewel, raw but dazzling, ready to be polished and displayed under his patronage. Jeanne's world changed, no longer confined to elegant taverns or public promenades. She now entered hushed salons where alliances, marriages, and fortunes were decided. There, conversation danced between theater and philosophy, Rousseau and Voltaire, though beneath the words, promises of power, were what truly exchanged hands. Jeanne quickly learned to listen with intent, to reply with wit without appearing presumptuous. She understood that the attention of men was not merely a pleasure, it was currency. Jean-Baptiste took care of everything. He dressed her in silks, adorned her with jewels, and drilled her in the invisible codes that transformed a commoner into a lady of the world. In his shadow, she was propelled upward with calculated precision. Every dinner, every ball, every whispered introduction was a move in a larger strategy, to push Jeanne into the highest orbit of influence. Already, whispers floated through perfumed corridors of grand hotels particuliers. They spoke of the blonde young woman with the clear laugh and sapphire eyes who seemed to conquer Paris as though it were a battlefield. Men grew infatuated, women grew envious. She could be playful and innocent one moment, grave and enigmatic the next, as though her gaze contained the traces of many lives already lived. What Jeanne did not yet realize was that Jean-Baptiste's ambitions were far greater than securing her a wealthy patron or an influential protector. His sights were set on Versailles itself, for in the twilight of his reign, Louis XV, aging, weary, and desperate for the illusion of youth, still sought solace in feminine beauty. And for du Barry, Jeanne was the perfect instrument to ensnare the king, to draw him from his melancholies, and to reap from him favors beyond imagining. Unknowingly, Jeanne was moving toward a destiny that would overwhelm her. In the gilded mirrors of Parisian salons, she already glimpsed a crown of sorts shimmering above her head. But this crown, forged from desire and scandal, would prove as heavy as it was fatal. Under the calculating eye of Jean-Baptiste du Barry, Jeanne became more than a young beauty. She became a project, almost a work of art in progress. He saw in her what no one else dared imagine, not merely a luxury courtesan, but the official favorite of the King of France. To achieve this, she had to be polished, transformed, armed with the codes of a world she barely understood. Every day was a lesson. She was trained to walk with poise, to tilt her head just so in greeting, to wield the silent language of fans and glances like hidden messages. She learned to smile with restraint, to hold a crystal glass with elegance, to let a gesture linger long enough to seem natural yet deliberate. Each movement was corrected, repeated, perfected. Fashion became her armor. The richest fabrics, velvet, brocade, airy muslins, draped her figure. Master wig-makers arranged her blonde hair in perfume cascades. Each jewel, each accessory, enhanced the image of a woman, not just seductive, but worthy of the polished floors of Versailles. She was no longer Jeanne Bécu, illegitimate daughter of Lorraine. She was becoming Madame du Barry, a creation designed to dazzle the weary eyes of the monarch. But beyond appearances, her spirit, too, was being shaped. Jean-Baptiste led her into libertine circles, where fortunes were gambled, where philosophers were quoted between bursts of laughter, where moral boundaries were tested. Jeanne listened, observed, absorbed. She learned how to flatter without appearing submissive, how to spark curiosity without crossing into insolence. She became mistress of the subtle art of pleasing everyone while belonging to no one entirely. Her reputation spread like wildfire. Her name was whispered in antechambers, sung in ribald verses about her beauty, compared to a modern Venus descending into Parisian streets. Already jealousy sharpened. Some noble women sneered at her, yet feared her even more, because her fresh allure threatened to eclipse their fading brilliance. For Jeanne, it still felt like a fascinating game, a stage on which she excelled effortlessly. Yet beneath the laughter, she sensed the vertigo of what was expected of her. With each step higher, she realized this destiny was not entirely her own. It was one Jean-Baptiste had drawn for her, pushing her like a chess piece toward the king. And already in hushed conversations, one name echoed with equal parts reverence and irony: Louis XV. Once the bien-aimé, adored by his people, he was now an aging monarch weighed down by melancholy, still searching in feminine beauty for comfort in his declining days. It was whispered that he needed a distraction, a new flame, and du Barry knew Jeanne could be that flame. Prepared like a rough diamond cut to be set in the richest of crowns, Jeanne was approaching, without yet realizing it, the threshold of Versailles. There, her glory and her ruin awaited. One winter evening, as Paris glowed with the candlelight of carriages and the thrill of balls, Jeanne was led, almost by chance, into the intimate circle of the king. The moment was carefully orchestrated by Jean-Baptiste du Barry. But for Jeanne, it retained the taste of destiny. In a hushed salon, perfumed with musk and warm wax, she caught sight for the first time of Louis XV, the monarch whose stern profile adorned the nation's coins, yet who, in that instant, appeared human, aged, weary, vulnerable. He was no longer the bien-aimé who, in his youth, had embodied triumphant majesty. His features were heavy, his eyes shadowed, his body marked by fatigue and illness. But when his gaze fell upon Jeanne, something in him seemed to stir back to life. She entered the room like a burst of light, clad in an ivory gown, trimmed with azure ribbons, and suddenly the courtly quarrels, the endless intrigues, the weight of years seemed to melt away. Their first exchange was disarmingly simple. Louis, accustomed to flattery and rigid reverence, found in Jeanne a refreshing spontaneity. She dared to laugh softly at one of his remarks. She dared to lift her blue eyes to his without drowning them in submission. In her bearing, there was no fear of displeasing, no greed to seduce, only a lively, insouciant nature that contrasted sharply with the stifling solemnity of the courtier's Louis XV. A man of pleasures as much as melancholy was conquered almost instantly. For him, Jeanne was a resurrection, an escape from the deadly ennui that consumed him. For her, it was sudden recognition. The king saw in her not just beauty, but a presence strong enough to banish his shadows. From then on, their encounters multiplied. Jeanne was invited to supper in increasingly select circles, then discreetly ushered into the king's private apartments. There, far from prying eyes, she discovered a fragile man, yearning more for tenderness than for lust. She listened. She laughed. She soothed. She did not need to pretend. Her natural gaiety was enough. Very soon, Louis could no longer do without her. The courtiers noticed. His mood lightened. His tempers eased. His days seemed to regain color. Whispers spread that a new star had risen in the king's orbit, and that star, born in the streets of Paris, bore the name Jeanne Bécu. Yet to cross the official threshold of Versailles required more than a smile and a shared bed. It demanded a title, legitimacy. Jeanne was still a commoner. A mere daughter of the people could not be presented as the king's acknowledged mistress. Jean-Baptiste, always the strategist, already knew the next step. A marriage of convenience, a necessary facade. Jeanne was soon to become the Comtesse du Barry. To pass through the gates of Versailles, it was not enough to charm the king. The rules of court protocol were unyielding. One needed a name, a title, a place in the aristocratic hierarchy. Jeanne Bécu, though already the king's radiant favorite, was still a commoner. Without a respectable facade, she could never be acknowledged as Louis XV's official mistress. It was then that Jean-Baptiste du Barry, master of schemes and illusions, set his plan in motion. He arranged a marriage of pure convenience between Jeanne and his younger brother, Guillaume du Barry, a pliable debt-ridden gambler, all too happy to have his obligations erased in exchange for lending his name. In April 1768, in a discreet ceremony, Jeanne became Comtesse du Barry. The change was immediate. With a stroke of the quill, she leapt from obscurity into the ranks of the nobility. She now possessed a coat of arms, a title, a signature of distinction. Everyone knew the marriage was a sham, but it was enough to satisfy the demands of etiquette. At last, the king's beloved could be presented at court. The transformation was spectacular. Her gowns rivaled those of princesses. Her diamonds blazed beneath Versailles chandeliers. Her entrance into the chateau was a shock. In the Hall of Mirrors, courtiers beheld this fresh beauty with her crystalline laughter, walking across the polished floors with unnerving confidence. But if Louis XV gazed upon her with adoration, others saw in her only scandal incarnate. A commoner raised to countess, elevated to the status of royal mistress. Great ladies smothered their laughter behind fans. Dukes sneered. Abbés moralized. Worse still, anonymous pamphlets circulated through Paris, portraying Madame du Barry as a crowned courtesan, a living emblem of decadence. Yet Jane, buoyed by her natural insouciance, faced hostility with a strange mix of naivety and courage. She did not compete with princesses by rigid etiquette, but by sheer brilliance. She smiled, she spoke, she laughed where others stiffened, and paradoxically, that freshness made her all the more irresistible in the king's eyes. In the privacy of his apartments, Louis XV seemed reborn. With Jeanne, he rediscovered the illusion of youth. She became his refuge from boredom, his remedy against solitude. He showered her with gifts, jewels, estates, titles for her relatives. The court gnashed its teeth, but Jeanne had found her place at the very heart of power. Thus, the illegitimate child of Vaucouleurs had, in the space of a few months, become the official mistress of the King of France, a dizzying ascent, a dazzling triumph. But with every step she took inside Versailles, Jeanne was unknowingly drawing closer to the shadows that would one day consume her. When Jeanne made her official entrance at Versailles, it struck the court like a thunderclap. In a world where every gesture, every glance, every word was codified, the appearance of a young woman with such humble origins provoked a scandal barely concealed behind murmurs. The galleries buzzed with whispers. Courtiers craned their necks to catch a glimpse of this favorite of obscure birth, now transformed into a countess through a convenient marriage. To the king, she was a source of light. Louis XV, worn down by age and solitude, seemed to regain an energy long thought lost in her presence. He smiled more often, showed greater clemency in his audiences, even laughed at meals that were usually weighted with gloom. Jeanne, with her lively nature, managed to lift the royal ennui. She did not speak like the other court ladies, encased in layers of etiquette. Her words carried the freshness of Parisian streets. Her laughter rang like a new melody. But to the courtiers, she was a living affront. The princesses of the blood openly despised her, refusing to acknowledge her with so much as a word. Dukes and marquises consoled themselves by spreading venomous pamphlets that circulated even into the streets of Paris, portraying Madame du Barry as a shameless courtesan, a symbol of monarchical corruption. Each of her appearances in the Hall of Mirrors was met with cold stares, perfunctory bows, and suffocating silence. Among her fiercest opponents was a newly arrived Archduchess from Austria, Marie Antoinette. Still a teenager, the Dauphine was quickly persuaded by her entourage that Jane embodied all that should be scorned: vice, frivolity, decadence. Between the two women, a silent war began at once. The innocent purity of the future queen against the scandalous embodiment of a corrupt ancien regime. It was a duel of symbols, and it marked the court's collective imagination. Yet Jeanne was not the schemer many imagined. Unlike other favorites, she had no ambition to dominate the king's council or to dictate policy. Her power lay elsewhere, in her ability to soothe the monarch, to rekindle in him the illusion of youth and pleasure. She reigned not in politics, but in intimacy. The evenings at Versailles took on a fairy tale glow. Draped in silk and diamonds, Madame du Barry floated through salons like an apparition. Her extravagant hairstyles, her sparkling jewels, her daring fashions made her a trendsetter. Artisans, couturiers, jewelers competed for the honor of serving her. To the people, she became a living mirror of royal magnificence, admired even as the nobles seethed with hatred. But behind the brilliance, a shadow lengthened. Every smile Louis gave Jeanne was perceived as a slap by those awaiting their turn at favor. Every lavish gift confirmed, in the eyes of the people, a monarchy blind and corrupt. Without realizing it, Jeanne was becoming one of the very symbols of luxury and excess that the revolution would one day condemn. Though Jeanne du Barry never sat in the king's council, never wielded a minister's pen, nor dictated the great lines of diplomacy, it would be naive to believe she held no influence. Her power was subtler, more intimate, yet sometimes just as decisive. She reigned in the place where decisions first took root, within the weary heart of the king. Louis XV, aging and gnawed by a deep melancholy, found in her a solace none had provided since Madame de Pompadour. Jeanne lacked her predecessor's encyclopedic intellect, but she possessed something equally precious, the gift of listening, of consoling, of making him laugh. When the king sank into boredom or lassitude, she restored levity, reminding him that life could still be sweet. From this intimacy sprang favors. Those clever enough to approach Madame du Barry with tact might see their petitions carried more easily to the king's ear. Courtiers understood the game. A compliment whispered over supper, a gallant gesture, and if Jeanne was charmed, she might intercede. She was no schemer by calculation, but her preferences, her sympathies, even her whims could determine the fate of a man or a family. This influence showed itself in spectacular ways. Under her spell, Louis XV showered her with fabulous jewels, dazzling necklaces, diamond sets that made every head turn during court balls. Rumors spread that he refused her nothing, not even the impossible. The extravagance of these gifts fed the most scathing pamphlets. The favorite was painted as a ruinous lich, the very embodiment of royal waste. Yet those who truly knew her saw a woman less calculating than legend suggested. Jeanne sincerely loved to please, not only the king, but also those around her. She had a generous heart, defending her friends, pleading for the unfortunate. Several artists, writers, and even humble servants owed her their fortune. But in the ruthless world of Versailles, even charity could be twisted into a stratagem. The brighter her star shone, the more rancor grew around her. Pamphlets grew more vicious, whispers more poisonous. She was accused of degrading the monarchy, of personifying the decadence of the ancien regime. Every burst of her laughter was interpreted as provocation, every jewel as an outrage, and above all, loomed the cold shadow of the Dauphine, Marie Antoinette. While Jeanne still basked in royal favor, the young archduchess was gaining influence of her own. Between them, a silent rivalry was taking shape, as though history itself were preparing a duel of symbols. The virtuous innocence of a future queen against the guilty frivolity of a royal mistress. In the gilded backstage of power, Jeanne still smiled, seemingly carefree. But within the gilded walls of Versailles, the echoes of hatred were already gathering. Hatred that one day would transform into her death sentence. If Jeanne du Barry believed she had secured her place beside the king, Versailles quickly proved to her that it was not merely a stage of fetes and finery. It was a battlefield of silent wars, fought with disdain, humiliation, and whispered vengeance. At the heart of this struggle rose a young woman destined for glory, Marie Antoinette, wife of the Dauphin, the future Queen of France. When the Dauphin entered court in 1770, she was only 14. Her youthful face already bore the majesty of the Habsburgs. She embodied the future, virtue, the alliance between France and Austria. Yet alongside her, in the gilded corridors of Versailles, stood Jeanne, the king's 30-year-old favorite, voluptuous, scandalous. Everything divided them. Blood versus common birth, proclaimed virtue versus sensuality. The future versus the fading past. Marie Antoinette, guided by her mentors and by the Dauphine Marie-Joseph de Saxe, was quickly warned. Madame du Barry was corruption incarnate, a symbol of vice and decadence. She was advised never to speak to her. The young archduchess obeyed with glacial discipline. In salons, at balls, in glittering galleries, she turned her head away, refusing even a word, a nod, a glance. For Jeanne, whose power had always lain in her spontaneity and charm, such silence was a public slap in the face. The entire court feasted on the silent duel. Crowds gathered to witness the two women in the same room, one dazzling in bold gowns, the other distant, wrapped in the dignity of royalty. Their exchanged glances, so people said, were enough to freeze the air. Pamphleteers inflamed the tension, contrasting the king's whore with the virtuous Dauphine. Jeanne, whether she wished it or not, became the foil against which the Dauphine's purity was exalted. Louis XV, aware of the discord, attempted to force reconciliation. He begged his granddaughter to speak to his beloved, if only once, to save appearances. Marie Antoinette relented reluctantly. At a dinner, she finally turned to Jeanne and uttered in an icy voice, "There are many people at Versailles today, a few words, nothing more." But in the echo of the gilded corridors, it was a triumph for Jeanne. The Dauphine had at last acknowledged her existence, and yet, the small concession changed nothing. The disdain remained. Factions hardened. Everyone knew time was against Jeanne. Louis XV was aging, weakened by illness. The day he breathed his last, Marie Antoinette, queen at last, would have full freedom to erase the hated favorite. Thus, behind the laughter and celebrations, Jeanne already lived through a silent tragedy. She'd conquered a king's heart, but she'd awakened the hatred of a queen-to-be, and in the implacable machinery of Versailles, that hatred was as deadly as a signed death sentence. As the years passed, the splendor of Versailles could no longer conceal the king's decay. Louis XV, once hailed as the bien-aimé, had become an old man, ravaged by illness and worn down by the burden of too long a reign. His once noble face was carved with deep wrinkles. His health faltered, his strength ebbed, and yet, beside him, Jeanne du Barry remained a vibrant presence, almost unreal. Like a flower still fresh in a withering garden, in his private apartments, she brought life back to him. She laughed, told him light-hearted stories, surrounded him with a tenderness that verged on filial devotion. For though Jeanne had entered his life as a mistress, she had, over time, become an indispensable confidant, a faithful companion in the solitude of his final days. Tired of politics and disputes, the king found in her a refuge from the cold indifference of ministers and the suffocating weight of duty. But beyond those intimate chambers, rancor grew sharper. To courtiers, Jeanne was nothing but an intruder, an upstart raised too high. Every smile she coaxed from the king was seen as a personal insult. Every jewel he gifted her, every favor he granted her family, stoked the pamphlets and satires that spread through Paris. In the streets, her name became synonymous with the monarchy's corruption. Du Barry, the emblem of royal decadence. Yet behind this painted image of a frivolous courtesan, there was a vulnerable woman. Jeanne was not blind to the murmurs, not deaf to the hatred mounting against her. She knew her entire world hung on the breath of a dying man. She feared, deeply, that with his last sigh, her own life would unravel. That fear became reality in the spring of 1774. Louis XV, weakened by persistent fevers, was struck by smallpox. The disease consumed him in just a few days. Physicians, powerless, resorted to bleedings and prayers. Versailles, usually vibrant with noise, froze in anxious silence. Jeanne watched over him desperately. She refused to leave his side, despite the pleas of courtiers who denounced her presence as unworthy of a man receiving the last rites. Priests accused her, enemies demanded her removal. At last, under relentless pressure, she was forced out of the royal apartments. She was not there for his final moments. On May 10th, 1774, Louis XV died, leaving France to a young royal couple, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. With his last breath vanished Jeanne's protection. That very day, Versailles slammed its doors on her. The once adored favorite fell into disgrace, expelled by those who had never ceased to loathe her. From celebrated countess, she became once again an outcast, driven from the palace like an unwelcome shadow. But her story was not yet over. It was only the beginning of a slow descent into the abyss. When the bells tolled for the death of Louis XV, Versailles became, overnight, a foreign land to Jeanne. The favorite who had once illuminated its galleries was reduced to silence and invisibility in a single night. For now a new couple reigned, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and for the young queen, the hour of revenge had arrived. Barely widowed of her royal protector, Jeanne was ordered to leave the chateau. Her apartments were emptied, her jewels seized by the king's officers, her household dispersed. Those who had bowed to her the day before now turned their faces away. The gilded doors of Versailles closed behind her with brutal finality. She sought refuge in her pavilion at Louvciennes, a charming residence once gifted to her by Louis XV. There, amid carefully laid gardens and delicately furnished salons, Jeanne tasted a bitter kind of freedom. No longer trapped by protocol or the cutting stares of princesses, she was also no longer anything at all. The echoes of feasts, of laughter, of royal suppers reached her like shattered memories, irretrievable, distant, absurd. The day stretched into a strange melancholy. Jeanne continued to gather a small circle of loyal friends, receive visitors, still collected jewels and precious objects, but the radiance had gone. The rumors in Paris no longer spoke of her beauty, only of her fall. Pamphlets, cruel as ever, portrayed her as the very emblem of corruption that had perished with the late king. Yet at heart, Jeanne had not lost her insouciant temperament. She still loved to laugh, to share suppers with trusted companions, to play at gaiety. But beneath those fleeting joys, a gnawing unease grew. She knew she was tolerated only at a distance, that at the first opportunity the court would strike more viciously. Marie Antoinette, now queen, would never forgive the silent humiliation of their years together. Louveciennes became a gilded cage. Jeanne sometimes received notable visitors, foreign diplomats curious to meet this uncrowned Queen of France. But her glory was gone. The jewels she still wore, the canvases Fragonard painted of her, were nothing more than relics of a vanished world. Meanwhile, in a France that was changing, her name returned to the lips of the people, spoken as a curse linked with luxury, scandal, and excess. Without knowing it, Jeanne du Barry, wandering through her gardens, was already a condemned woman on borrowed time, an echo of the ancien regime that history had yet to summon before its tribunal. At Louveciennes, Jeanne lived a suspended existence, fragile as a bubble of glass. Yet beyond her tranquil gardens, France was catching fire. The murmur of hungry peasants swelled into a rumble of revolt. The 1780s were years of shortages, riots, and anger that seeped even into aristocratic salons. Jeanne, secluded in her residence, could not ignore that the old world was cracking. She still hosted guests, diplomats, financiers, loyal friends. Her suppers at Louveciennes were famed for refinement. The finest wines poured, Fragonard's canvases admired, conversations flowing on literature and politics. But outside, whispers grew louder. To the public imagination, the fallen favorite remained the embodiment of useless luxury, of scandalous frivolity. People still saw her glittering in the diamonds gifted by Louis XV, diamonds that seemed insults to the misery of the streets. In 1789, as the revolution erupted, Jeanne understood. Her name condemned her. She tried to retreat into privacy, to live quietly, but her past clung to her like a brand. Pamphleteers resurrected her story, painting her as the incarnation of royal decadence, a target as guilty as hated ministers. She maintained ties with England, sending jewels and valuables abroad in secret, hoping to preserve part of her fortune. These transactions, whispered confidences, would later resurface in court as evidence against her. For in revolutionary eyes, any contact with foreigners was treason. Loneliness deepened. Old friends, fearful of suspicion, slipped away. The laughter that had once filled her salons grew scarce. Jeanne wandered through her gardens like a powerless witness to a collapsing world. Memories of Versailles, its brilliance, its triumphs, now seemed unreal, absurd. Yet in her heart, a faint hope persisted. She believed in mercy, in the possibility of retreating quietly into obscurity. She was wrong. In the revolution's pitiless logic, there was no refuge for symbols of the ancien regime, and Jeanne du Barry, more than most, embodied that symbol. A common-born woman, crowned with jewels by a disgraced king. The storm drew closer. Louveciennes, with its elegant walls and perfumed salons, would soon cease to be a haven. It would become a trap where history itself would come to claim her. The autumn of 1793 was heavy, saturated with fear and blood. The terror ruled Paris. Each day, carts full of the condemned rumbled toward the Place de la Révolution. In such an atmosphere, where the faintest rumor could cost a head, the name of Jeanne du Barry resurfaced with brutal force. At Louveciennes, the fallen favorite still believed she might hide in the shadows of her memories. But her past dealings with England betrayed her. It was discovered that she had sent jewels and precious objects to London, not from conspiracy, but from prudence. For revolutionaries, this alone sufficed. A woman who corresponded with the enemy could only be a traitor. One September morning, guards stormed her pavilion. The heavy thud of boots echoed on polished marble, drowning the perfume of fresh roses in their vases. Jeanne, caught off guard, had no chance to flee. Her delicate hands, once adorned with sparkling rings, were bound with coarse rope. Servants, paralyzed with dread, could only watch as she was led away like a criminal. She was taken to Paris, first locked in Sainte-Pélagie prison, then transferred to the Conciergerie, the antechamber of death, where so many illustrious shadows had already waited their turn. Marie Antoinette, the Girondins, nobles and unknowns alike. The walls oozed dampness. The air reeked of despair. For Jeanne, accustomed to silks and perfumes, it was a brutal descent into the mud of history. Witnesses reported that terror consumed her. Unlike other prisoners who faced their fate with stoic silence, Jeanne wept, begged, fought against the inevitable. Her once sparkling blue eyes became two pools of fear. She pleaded for mercy, promised redemption, cried out for her life. But in Paris under the terror, such cries only provoked cruel smiles. Her name, printed in revolutionary newspapers, stirred hatred. She was no longer a woman, but a symbol, the courtesan of a disgraced king, the embodiment of royal excess. Her generosity, her moments of kindness, her naive gaiety, none of that mattered. To the people, she personified the corruption that had to be purged, and in her dark cell, Jeanne understood the threat of her life was nearing its end. She, who had once shone in Versailles' mirrors and danced beneath its glittering chandeliers, was now only a trembling shadow awaiting the fall of the blade. On December 6, 1793, Jeanne du Barry was brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The courtroom was packed. Curious citizens, journalists, partisans of the terror, all eager to behold the former royal favorite. She entered pale, simply dressed, so different from the dazzling vision that had once lit Versailles. Yet in her tired features lingered a fragile trace of beauty, a faint glow amid the darkness. The trial was nothing more than a formality. The charges rained down relentlessly: correspondence with France's enemies, sending wealth abroad, treason against the nation. Each accusation fell like a hammer, echoing a verdict already decided. Jeanne tried to defend herself. Her voice trembled, but her words carried sincerity. She explained that the jewels sent to England were only a precaution, not a conspiracy. She begged them to see her as a woman of flesh and blood, not as the monstrous symbol they had made of her. But the tribunal was deaf. To the judges of the terror, Jeanne was not a defendant. She was a target, an offering to appease popular vengeance. How could the revolution allow the king's mistress to live, when so many innocents had already mounted the scaffold? Witnesses condemned her. Former servants, pressed by fear, confirmed her contacts with England. Pamphlets, venomous caricatures, were cited as evidence, as if slanders could serve as truth. With every word, Jeanne collapsed further, her eyes filling with tears. She insisted again and again that she was not guilty, but her sobs and desperate cries only fed the hatred of those who saw in her the weakness of the aristocracy itself. The verdict came swift, merciless. Guilty of treason, condemned to death. The sentence, long expected, was greeted by murmurs of satisfaction. Some in the room applauded, others sneered. Jeanne crumbled. Her legs gave way, her hands clasped in prayer. She begged for clemency, for delay, for a miracle. But there would be no mercy, no reprieve. That night, back in her cell at the conciergerie, she wept bitterly. Unlike so many others who met death with grim pride, Jeanne clung to life with the raw instinct of survival. She did not want to die. She was no heroine of tragedy, only a fragile, terrified woman, desperate for one more day, one more breath. 2 days later, the guillotine awaited her. In the icy cell of the conciergerie, Jeanne spent her final night. The damp walls seeped cold, the stone floor drained away all warmth. Once adorned with silk and velvet, she was now reduced to a trembling figure in coarse linen. Her beauty, once the talk of Paris and Versailles, was dulled by tears and terror, yet her blue eyes still held a flicker, the stubborn flame of life refusing to go out. The guards later recounted that she wept without pause, begging for mercy, imploring for reprieve. Unlike Marie Antoinette, who had walked to her death with austere dignity, Jeanne clung to life with almost childlike desperation. She repeated again and again that she had done no wrong, that her only crime was to have loved and lived under the king's protection. She prayed, she confessed, she scribbled trembling notes to her few remaining friends. In the silence of the night, she imagined she already heard the guillotine, the sharp crack of its blade that had echoed so many times across the Place de la Révolution. Each prisoner's cry, each guard's step made her heart pound as though it would burst. Time itself seemed to warp, dragging on, twisting into a torture. More cruel than the blade to come, memories flooded her mind, cruel and vivid. She saw again the chandeliers of Versailles, their light scattering across her diamonds, the king's laughter, the envious stares of courtiers. She wandered once more through her rose gardens at Louveciennes, still believing she could outrun hatred. All of it now seemed like a dream, unreal and absurd, shattered beyond repair. At dawn, a pale gray light slipped through the narrow window. Jeanne collapsed in exhaustion. When the guards came for her, she could scarcely rise. They had to lift her, to support her failing steps. Her legs refused to carry her. She realized then that her final struggle was no longer to live, but to summon what courage she could to meet death. Through the frozen corridors, chained and trembling, she walked toward the daylight. But this day's light was not that of Versailles' glittering halls. It was the light of the scaffold. On the morning of December 8th, 1793, Jeanne was pulled from her cell and led to the cart of the condemned. In the courtyard of the conciergerie, the winter air cut into her frail body. She wore only a plain white shift, a poorly tied kerchief, nothing to remind anyone of the finery she had once paraded at Versailles. Her blonde hair, once powdered and styled with art, now hung in loose, disheveled strands around her face. They bound her and forced her into the cart. Around her, the crowd had already gathered, eager for the spectacle. The Parisians wanted to see the king's infamous mistress, now a fallen woman, condemned as the very symbol of the ancien regime's decadence. Cheers rose up from the masses. Death to the king's whore. See how luxury pays its debts. Each insult struck her like a lash. The cart jolted forward, its wheels rattling over frozen cobblestones. The route from the conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution seemed endless. Horses plodded slowly, flanked by guards, while the mob pressed closer, shouting, laughing, spitting. Jeanne wept openly. Her chest heaved with sobs, her tears streamed unchecked. Unlike many prisoners who met death in proud silence, she pleaded desperately for her life, turning to passers-by, to guards, even to priests who walked beside her. Witnesses later said, she spoke ceaselessly, begging for mercy, clinging to every second. Her fear was naked, raw, impossible to hide. The frivolous favorite once accused of insolence now appeared stripped bare, just a woman trembling before the abyss. The people watched, divided between hatred and pity. Some mocked, delighted to see her reduced to terror. Others, though silent, felt their hearts twist at the sight of such human fragility. For beneath the mask of courtesan and countess, Jeanne revealed the universal face of fear. At last, the cart turned into the square. There, rising above the crowd, the guillotine loomed black against the gray sky, its blade glinting, its wooden frame soaked with blood. Jeanne saw it, recoiled, let out a strangled cry. She tried to shrink back into the cart, to flee the monstrous machine. But there was no escape. The final act of her tragedy was about to begin. When the cart halted in the center of the Place de la Révolution, a heavy silence spread across the square. Only the creak of wood and the stamping of horses broke the stillness. Every gaze turned toward Jeanne du Barry, the former royal favorite, in ma fille de fille, chaude, shoy, Jeanne, once glittering in silk and diamonds, now appeared as a pale, trembling figure, her eyes red from tears, her body convulsing with shivers. They helped her down from the cart. Her legs gave way at once, and she had to be held upright as she staggered to the steps of the scaffold. Each stair she climbed was another torment. At the top, she lifted her gaze toward the guillotine, that towering frame of dark wood, its blade gleaming, already stained with the blood of those who had gone before. The crowd held its breath, unlike Marie Antoinette, who had mounted the steps with frozen dignity. Jeanne was overcome by the primal instinct to live. Her sobs broke out in the open, piercing, desperate, shattering the image of the frivolous courtesan. She turned to the executioners, to the crowd, pleading, "Mercy! Mercy! Let me live a little longer!" Witnesses swore. Her voice rang so intensely it unsettled even some of the onlookers. But pity had no place here. No reprieve would come. The executioner seized her shoulders, forcing her to kneel. Jeanne resisted, struggled, pulled back at the edge of the plank. In a final surge of terror, she cried out the words that would echo through centuries. "Just one more moment, Monsieur le Bourreau. Just one more instant." It was the rawest of cries, stripped of pride or philosophy. A plea not for honor, but for one more heartbeat. That naked fear, more than any grand gesture, carved itself into memory. It revealed the truth beneath the courtesan's mask. A woman, vulnerable and terrified, clinging to life until the very end. At last they bound her, pressed her beneath the lunette. The blade dropped with a brutal crack. Her head tumbled into the basket, her blonde hair mingling with the blood of others before her. The crowd roared, though some turned away, shaken despite themselves. That morning in December, it was not only Jeanne du Barry who died. With her fell a fragment of the Ancien Regime itself, its brilliance, its excess, its illusions, swallowed forever by the Revolution's steel. When Jeanne du Barry's head rolled into the straw basket, a shudder passed through the crowd. Some erupted in applause, drunk on vengeance. Others stood mute, disturbed by the raw, unvarnished terror she had shown. For though the Revolution demanded sacrifices, this execution had revealed something different. Not a martyr, not a stoic hero, but a woman overwhelmed by fear, unable to mask the desperate will to live. Her cry, "Just one more moment, Monsieur le Bourreau," lingered longer than the crack of the blade itself. Quickly, the crowd dispersed. The carts moved on. The market stalls reopened. Paris returned to its restless rhythm. Such was the merciless cadence of the terror. One head fell, then another and another. Yet, in the collective imagination, Jeanne's death remained singular. She had not gifted the Revolution with a noble death. Instead, she had left behind a mirror of humanity, fragile, trembling, universal. At Louveciennes, her once sparkling pavilion now stood deserted. Its halls echoed with silence. The mirrors that had reflected her laughter now returned only emptiness. The jewels she had sent to England could not purchase the seconds she had begged for. Her portraits, painted by Fragonard, silken, smiling, radiant, became relics of a world forever gone. The revolutionaries, of course, knew the truth. They had not executed a woman so much as a symbol. Jeanne embodied everything they wished to destroy: ostentation, arbitrary privilege, the frivolity of royal excess. Her death, more than her life, sealed her as the scapegoat of a dying age. And yet, in secret, another image endured. Witnesses remembered her generosity, her laughter, her naivete, more than her cunning. Many later admitted she had not been a conspirator, that she had not deserved such a fate. But the revolution was not about judging individuals. It was about erasing symbols. Thus ended the journey of Jeanne Bécu, illegitimate child, transformed into countess, adored by a king, and sacrificed to a people's wrath. Her blood mingled with that of so many others. Another verse in the tragic litany of 1793. After her death, Jeanne du Barry did not vanish into oblivion. On the contrary, her memory lingered, haunting the French imagination like a golden shadow stained in blood. Her name, once whispered in salons and later printed in chronicles, remained tied to the image of a bygone era, the dazzling Versailles of mirrors and diamonds, of libertine suppers and royal decadence, swept away by the revolution's storm. For the revolutionaries, she was the perfect symbol of corruption, an incarnation of the monarchy's excess that had to be destroyed so the nation could be purified. They placed her among the infamous favorites, proof that kings had squandered their power in vanity and pleasure. Her execution was presented as an act of justice, a triumph of the people over the arrogance of the court. But in the decades that followed, another vision of her emerged. Writers, chroniclers, and painters began to depict her not as a conspirator, but as a victim. A simple woman, born without title, who rose by her beauty and gaiety only to be sacrificed by an unforgiving society. They recalled her generosity, her lightheartedness, her almost childlike innocence in the face of court intrigues. They argued her downfall came less from her own faults than from the hatred of others and the violence of her times. Thus, Jeanne became an ambivalent figure. On one side, the frivolous courtesan, the king's whore bedecked in jewels and mocked in pamphlets. On the other, the vulnerable woman, pleading for just one more moment before the blade. Her humanity laid bare in that final cry. That last image, more than any necklace or gown, engraved her name into collective memory. Even today, her story fascinates. Visitors wander Louveciennes, imagining her in its salons. They study Fragonard's portraits, where she smiles unaware of her coming doom. They reread the trial accounts, where her trembling words still echo. And in that echo, Jeanne du Barry becomes more than a royal mistress. She becomes the mirror of a century in twilight, a century of brilliance and corruption, of beauty and brutality, of laughter and blood. Thus the curtain falls on her extraordinary life. Jeanne Bécu, illegitimate child turned countess, lover of a king and victim of a revolution, endures as a figure both dazzling and tragic. Her legacy is not that of a queen or reformer, but of an ordinary woman made extraordinary by fate, and destroyed by an era that forgave nothing.